Hi, everyone. So again, I'm Jenny Ravelo. I'm the Global Health Reporter for Devex. And with me today, I'm really pleased to have Dr. Richard Hatchett, the CEO of CEPI. As you all know, CEPI, the work of CEPI during this pandemic. But just a brief history is really CEPI is a very young organization launched in 2017. Conceived from the West Africa Ebola outbreak, and its mandate is really advancing, uh, accelerating the development of vaccines for infectious diseases. But then COVID happened, and as you know, as I mentioned earlier, CEPI has played a key role in advancing some of the COVID vaccines that a lot of people have received today. But there's still a lot. But first of all, Dr. Hatchett, thank you for joining us today.
Sorry about that. It's a pleasure, Jenny. Thanks for having me.
Well, I think my first question would be what everyone would want to hear, really. And if you can give us an update on the vaccine supply to COVAX. As you know, everyone's really there are anxieties, there are questions when countries are going to get their doses.
Sure. No. Let me say that COVAX is working. We have now delivered over 70 million doses to, I believe, 125 countries and participants, who are working with COVAX. But that is significantly behind where we had hoped to be at this point. And the reasons we're behind are that the initial supply for COVAX, a very substantial portion of that supply was emerging from India. And of course, the timing of the terrible outbreak in India, the Indian manufacturers understandably are allocating their supplies to addressing the needs of the Indian population, and that has resulted in delays in delivery to COVAX, and so we are not where we had hoped to be, but we are working obviously both with our partners in India, particularly the Serum Institute, but with our other partners who are manufacturing in other locations to see what we can do to accelerate the availability of doses.
You mentioned about the Serum Institute, and the CEO of Serum Institute just recently, mentioned that they may not be able to restart the supply outside India until the end of the year. Where are you now looking into specifically? Are there other vaccines that you hope will be available soon?
Well, there are, and as I said, we are still working quite closely with the Serum Institute, and we hope that the availability of supply will be restarted earlier, much significantly earlier than the end of the year. But we have to continue to watch the epidemiology in India unfold and the needs of the Indian population. But just within the last 10 days or so, COVAX has signed agreements with Novavax, with Moderna, and with Johnson & Johnson that will make available well over 1 billion doses of vaccine, many of those, hundreds of millions of those, within 2021, and a portion of those, spilling over into 2022. We're also, working with a number of high-income countries that are supporters of COVAX, and we are promoting the sharing of doses. Countries that are well positioned with respect to vaccine supply, we are urging them to share doses now, and to make those doses available as soon as possible. And we've already had, I believe, 8 or 9 countries that have signaled that they will be sharing doses, including recently the United States of America has announced, on top of the 60 million doses that they had previously discussed sharing with the rest of the world, an additional 20 million doses. So that, we've seen the contributions from Norway, for example, recently, from Sweden, from France and Spain and Portugal and others, and we certainly want to encourage those.
Just a quick follow up on that, because a lot in a lot of low and middle income countries, they need the vaccines now. So, are any of those vaccines, have they started to come in? When are they? Do you have a timeline when countries would be able to receive them? And just a quick one for countries that for populations in countries that receive first dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine, how are you kind of feeling, making sure that they'll receive their second dose on time?
Well, so I think there will be delays for some countries. Many of the countries used up the first allotment of doses and provided first doses to a larger number rather than reserving a portion of those first doses to provide second doses. And epidemiologically, that probably is a good strategy based on what we are coming to understand about first dose efficacy. And as you know, even in some high income countries in the UK, where I'm based, they extended the dosing interval for the AstraZeneca and the Pfizer vaccines as a way of increasing population immunity quickly, and that seems to have worked quite well in Britain, where cases are subsiding, but many people still have not received a second dose of vaccine yet. So in terms of the dose donations, I believe the donation from France, for example, was very quickly converted into a shipment of supplies to Mauritania, if I'm remembering correctly. We're working very closely with the other countries. We're trying to put in place mechanisms that allow for very rapid, if a country makes a decision to donate doses, that we can take and process that donation very quickly and move those doses out to countries that need doses as quickly as possible.
Now, I also know that CEPI is part of this COVAX manufacturing task force. Can you just tell us a bit about what the aim of the task force is, and how will it sort of address the current supply shortages that the world is facing today?
Well, I'll step back slightly and say that we from the very beginning, from early last year, we recognized that when vaccines first became available, by definition, they would be characterized by scarcity initially, and the real challenge is to shorten that period of scarcity to the greatest extent possible, and to make sure that the most vulnerable populations are able to access vaccine. In late February, or even maybe in early February, we began to have concerns about the manufacturing supply chain. And we actually co-sponsored a meeting with some of the industry association partners at Chatham House in early March around what we saw as emerging challenges within the supply chain. That companies that were manufacturing vaccine didn't have access to the raw materials and the critical consumables, the plastic bags, the filters and culture media to actually produce vaccine, and thus the manufacturing capacity that we have would have suboptimal output. So we've been focusing on this for a while. Ultimately, we've recognized that there are a number of potential barriers to manufacturing across the entire life cycle of the manufacturing process that we could potentially address. The first and most pressing, most immediate, with the highest payoff in terms of increasing vaccine doses in the next 1 to 3 months, is fixing those supply chain problems. But there may be manufacturers who need access, for example, to fill and finish capacity. And COVAX has reserved fill and finish capacity that we can match with partners. In a longer term frame, one of the problems I think that we are seeing in terms of, that have produced the inequitable distribution of supply that we are observing, is that vaccine manufacturing capacity is inequitably distributed right now. It's in North America, in Europe, in China, and in India, all of which are very large populations that can absorb a lot of vaccine. Very, very little vaccine manufacturing in Africa, limited amounts of vaccine manufacturing in South America, and in other regions. And so ultimately, I think looking towards the future, while this won't produce increased vaccine supply in the next month or 2 months or 6 months, I think we ultimately need to see more equitably distributed manufacturing capacity globally. And that also falls under the remit of this task force.
Have you identified, particular countries or regions where you see the task force can help build these capacities for the future?
For the longer term. So WHO is taking the lead on that effort. They've put out a call for a request for information. Essentially, they're asking countries that are interested to identify themselves, asking partners who might be willing to transfer their technology to identify themselves as well. The African Union has developed an African vaccine strategy, which includes a focus on manufacturing, and they've identified 3 countries that they have put, at the head of the priority list in Senegal, Rwanda, and South Africa. And I think we are eager to work with regional partners like the African Union, and to work in concert. We'll need the financing institutions. We'll need the local and regional political will, and of course, we can bring a great deal of technical capability and our contacts with our industry partners to the table. It's going to take all of those sectors working together for this to succeed.
I'm curious about timelines. How long do you envision this? You said it's not going to happen next month, in the next few months, but how long it will take for us to see these capacities available in these countries outside North America and outside Europe?
Well, I would differentiate between 2 problems. I mean, there's the problem of securing doses now for COVAX and for global distribution to address the pandemic needs now. And there are aspects of the task force, focusing on, as I said, on the supply chain and on some of the matchmaking between partners that have the potential to increase vaccine supply really within the next couple of months or even 6 months. Efforts to build new capacity, those are long-term efforts. They will take years. I'll give you an example. I think it's a relevant example. WHO supported the Global Action Plan to increase influenza vaccine manufacturing. This was because of concerns about pandemic influenza. That program extended over a decade, actually, to transfer that technology to manufacturers and to help them build their workforces and to build capability to produce. I think they worked at one point with up to 12 different vaccine manufacturers in different locations around the world. Ultimately, about half of those were successes and are continuing to this day to manufacture influenza vaccine, and about half failed. In aggregate, that increased the manufacturing capacity for influenza vaccine by about 1 billion doses a year, which is terrific. But that shows the scale of investment and the need for an enduring commitment to these projects. Now, I think in the current circumstances, the urgency in the middle of a pandemic is much greater, perhaps, than it was for that previous program. So we're hoping those timelines can be compressed. But I think realistically, we're talking about years to stand that capacity up, and it's going to take not just investment in building facilities, but also investments in people, in workforce development, investments in regulatory capacity building, and it will take sustained political will from the countries that are receiving the assistance to build this capacity, and sustained commitment from them and from the donor partners for this to succeed.
I think lastly, what's next for CEPI? We're still very much in this pandemic. What are you going to be be busy about in the next few months?
Well, CEPI's role through the pandemic has evolved. In the first couple of months, it was really important for us to, ignition to just get these vaccine development programs going. Over the last year, working with Gavi, WHO, now UNICEF, we've been very concerned about access. At this point, and we've made very important contributions to R&D and through our R&D agreements to securing access commitments for the COVAX facility. Looking towards the future, at this point, I think we need to be thinking about, there are lots of vaccines based on the currently available technologies addressing COVID. We are still interested in making investments to have vaccines that are, variant proof, that are broadly active against, many strains of COVID. We ultimately think it's important for the world to at least attempt to develop broadly acting, broadly protective coronavirus vaccines that protect against COVID, but also against other potential future coronaviruses that might emerge and cause other pandemics. As we sort of move beyond the pandemic, hopefully in the next couple of years, we've established a major goal for us is to dramatically compress vaccine development timelines from the 326 days from sequence to first licensure that we saw last year with the Pfizer vaccine to as little as 100 days. We think pandemic risk is going to continue. To address that risk, we must compress those timelines.
I think we're very much looking forward to that ambitious goal, and it would be really a big help to the world and a lot of populations in need of vaccines that we don't have in other diseases as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Hatchett. It's been a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Jenny.